The first sign that the HOA had it out for me was the letter taped to my front door. Bold red letters stamped across the top read, "Notice of violation." I sighed, knowing exactly who was behind this Patricia Gaines, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board. Middle-aged, perpetually scowling, and armed with an arsenal of passive-aggressive emails, she had made it her mission to turn our once friendly neighborhood into a bureaucratic nightmare. I ripped the letter off the door and scanned it. Unauthorized pool usage, violation of HOA regulations. Effective immediately, homeowner is restricted from using the community pool until further notice. I blinked. Restricted from using my own pool? I owned this house outright. The pool was within my backyard, well-maintained and fully compliant with city codes. And yet, somehow, Patricia and her band of rule-happy enforcers had decided that I wasn't allowed to swim in it. I marched over to the HOA office, which was just a converted clubhouse at the edge of the neighborhood. Inside, Patricia sat behind a desk cluttered with paperwork and an oversized coffee mug that read HOA, Keeping Communities Civil. "Patricia," I said, holding up the letter, "mind explaining why I'm banned from my own pool?" She looked up, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Oh, Oliver, I was expecting you." She folded her hands neatly. "You violated HOA Policy 14B regarding pool aesthetics. Your pool furniture does not match the approved community color scheme. Plus, we received complaints that you were hosting loud gatherings." I stared at her. "Patricia, I live alone. The only gatherings happening in my backyard are me, a book, and a cold drink," she sniffed. "Regardless, the board has made its decision." I took a deep breath, reining in my frustration. "Then I'll appeal." She gave a saccharine smile. "Oh, you can at next month's meeting." That was it. I knew Patricia had it out for me after I had shut down her attempt to raise HOA fees last year, but this was ridiculous. If she wanted to play games, I could play too, so I started digging. Patricia loved her power, but she wasn't exactly subtle. Over the years, she'd been pushing for HOA-funded improvements, new fencing, walkway extensions, and even a private office for her HOA duties. The problem? I had never seen any official permits for these so-called upgrades. I spent the next few days going through public records, and sure enough, there was no permits filed for major structural modifications on HOA property. I grinned. Patricia had just handed me the perfect way to turn the tables. Armed with the knowledge that Patricia had been pushing through unapproved modifications without obtaining permits, I knew I had the leverage I needed to fight back. But I wasn't about to launch my attack without gathering every possible piece of evidence. I started with a quiet visit to the city records office, a place most HOA tyrants assumed homeowners never thought to check. After a bit of waiting and some polite conversation with the clerk, I got exactly what I needed: a formal report showing that no permits had been filed for any of the HOA-funded projects in the past 5 years. That included the new fencing around the clubhouse, the extended walkways, and most importantly, the small office space Patricia had claimed for herself. I wasn't just dealing with a petty power trip anymore. This was outright fraud. HOA funds, which came from the dues we all paid, had been used improperly, with no oversight and no legal documentation. The city could and would shut it all down once they found out, but I wasn't done yet. Before making my move, I needed to ensure there was no way for Patricia to weasel her way out of this. I took a slow drive around the neighborhood, snapping photos of every questionable improvement I had seen over the years. The extended walkways that led up to the clubhouse. Cracked and uneven, likely installed by an unlicensed contractor. The fencing that surrounded the community pool, warped and rusting in places despite supposedly being brand new. And then there was Patricia's so-called office, a converted storage shed behind the clubhouse, complete with a personal air conditioning unit and a sign that read HOA board members only. The arrogance was astounding. Once I had all the photographic evidence I needed, I drafted a detailed complaint to the city's building code enforcement office. I didn't just mention the lack of permits, I provided dates, expenses from public HOA records, and pointed out the safety violations that came from these unapproved structures. The city didn't take kindly to organizations bypassing regulations, especially when it involved public safety and misappropriation of funds. With the complaint officially filed, I knew it was only a matter of time before an inspection was scheduled. But I wasn't going to sit back and wait. I needed to make sure Patricia felt the pressure before the city even arrived. The next HOA meeting was only a few days away, and I made sure to show up early. Patricia sat at the head of the table, flanked by her usual Allies board members who either feared her or benefited from her control. The rest of the room was filled with homeowners, most of whom had no idea what I was about to reveal. When the meeting started, Patricia wasted no time in addressing me directly. She looked smug, as if she had already won. "Oliver, I assume you're here to discuss your pool violation," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "Unfortunately, that matter is closed unless you'd like to formally submit an appeal, which will be reviewed next month." I didn't bother playing along. I stood up, clearing my throat so the entire room could hear me. "Actually, Patricia, I'm here to talk about something far more important, specifically the illegal modifications made to HOA property without proper permits." That got everyone's attention. Murmurs spread across the room as homeowners exchanged confused glances. Patricia's expression faltered for just a second before she forced a smile. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said smoothly. I pulled out a folder and placed it on the table in front of me. I did some research. In the past 5 years, not a single permit has been filed for the various improvements you've pushed through, including the fencing, the walkways, and most notably the office space you've been using for yourself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few residents leaned forward, eager to see the documents I had brought. Patricia's face paled, but she quickly recovered. "That's a serious accusation," she said, her voice tight. "I assure you all projects were approved by the board." I nodded. "Approved by the board, maybe. But not by the city." I held up a copy of my complaint. "I reported the violations this morning. Expect an inspection soon." The room erupted into whispers, and for the first time, Patricia looked genuinely rattled. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another homeowner spoke up. "Wait a minute," a man named Greg said, frowning. "If these projects weren't legally permitted, does that mean our HOA fees have been paying for work that could get us fined?" I nodded. "That's exactly what it means. And if the city deems the structures unsafe or improperly built, they'll demand they be removed at our expense." That was all it took. The room turned against Patricia in an instant. People started demanding answers, questioning where their money had gone, and some even called for a full audit of the HOA's finances. Patricia tried to regain control, but the damage was done. By the time the meeting ended, she was visibly shaken, her usual confidence shattered. But the real blow came a week later when the city inspectors arrived. They weren't happy. Every single unapproved modification was flagged, and within days, the HOA received an official notice demanding that the structures be either properly permitted or removed immediately. The best part: the community wasn't willing to foot the bill. At the next emergency meeting, homeowners overwhelmingly voted to hold Patricia personally responsible for the mess. She was forced to step down as president, and a new board was elected, one that prioritized transparency and fairness. As for me, I enjoyed a relaxing swim in my pool that very evening, knowing that justice had finally been served. The fallout from Patricia's downfall didn't just stop at her resignation. The homeowners, now freshly aware of how badly their money had been mismanaged, were furious. The new HOA board, under immense pressure, had no choice but to conduct a full financial audit. What they found made the illegal modifications look like petty infractions. The HOA's financial records were a mess. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into vague, administrative expenses, with no clear explanation of where the money had actually gone. Checks had been written to contractors who didn't seem to exist, and worst of all, Patricia had been reimbursing herself for HOA-related duties that had no paper trail to justify them. The community was livid. Not only had she pushed through illegal modifications, but she had also been lining her own pockets while doing it. The board had no choice but to escalate the matter. A formal complaint was filed with the state's HOA regulatory agency, and Patricia was officially under investigation for misappropriation of funds. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. Despite being disgraced, she still had allies in the neighborhood people she had favored over the years with relaxed enforcement of HOA rules or conveniently overlooked violations. These were the same people who had backed her during her reign, and now they were scrambling to protect her. I started noticing subtle changes in the way the HOA was handling business. The new board, despite being elected by the community, was facing resistance from the remnants of Patricia's supporters. Meetings that should have been straightforward were suddenly bogged down with bureaucratic nonsense. Requests for financial transparency were met with delays. It was clear that Patricia's influence hadn't disappeared entirely. Then, things took a more personal turn. One morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It wasn't from the new HOA leadership, it was from a lawyer representing Patricia. She was threatening to sue me for defamation and harassment. The letter claimed that my accusations had caused her emotional distress and that she was seeking damages. It was laughable, considering everything she had done, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I called up a lawyer of my own, a friend from college who specialized in real estate law. After reviewing everything, he assured me that Patricia's case was as flimsy as her leadership had been. She had no grounds to sue me, especially since everything I had reported was backed up by public records. Still, I wasn't going to sit around and wait for her next move. If Patricia wanted to play legal games, I was more than happy to escalate things further. I met with the new HOA board and presented everything I had found: the financial discrepancies, the illegal modifications, and now the legal threats she was making against me. The board was already under pressure from the homeowners, and they knew that if they didn't act decisively, the entire HOA could be held accountable for Patricia's actions. They made the call to hand over all financial records to law enforcement, and within a week, Patricia was officially under criminal investigation. That should have been the end of it. But Patricia, in her desperation, decided to go nuclear. One evening, I came home to find my front yard vandalized. My mailbox had been smashed, my trash cans overturned, and someone had thrown paint across my driveway. Whoever had done it hadn't even bothered to be subtle. There were footprints leading straight from the mess back to the sidewalk. I checked my security cameras, which I had installed months ago in anticipation of HOA nonsense, and sure enough, I caught everything. The footage showed two of Patricia's closest allies, both former board members, sneaking onto my property in the dead of night. It wasn't just petty vandalism, it was an intimidation tactic. I wasted no time. The next morning, I took the footage straight to the police. Within days, both of them were arrested for trespassing and property damage. The incident only solidified Patricia's downfall. With her allies now facing criminal charges, she had no more protection. The investigation into her financial misconduct ramped up, and soon, she was facing real legal consequences. By the time everything was said and done, Patricia was forced to sell her house to pay back the stolen HOA funds. She disappeared from the neighborhood, her reign of terror officially over. With her gone, the HOA finally started operating the way it was supposed to: fairly, transparently, and with the community's best interests at heart. The illegal modifications were either removed or properly permitted, and the homeowners saw a significant reduction in their fees now that the unnecessary expenses had been eliminated. As for me, I never received another violation notice again. And every evening, as I relaxed in my fully legal, fully private pool, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, justice had won. With Patricia gone and the HOA under new leadership, the neighborhood finally had a chance to recover from the years of mismanagement. But while most people were eager to move forward, I wasn't quite ready to let things go just yet. There was still unfinished business. The financial audit had revealed more than just Patricia's misconduct. The new board, desperate to regain the trust of the homeowners, had made all HOA financial records available for review. I took my time combing through them, and the deeper I looked, the worse things got. It turned out that Patricia hadn't just been misappropriating funds, she had also been handing out no-bid contracts to her personal acquaintances, inflating costs on projects that should have been straightforward. One name kept appearing in the records: Richard Lanning. He had been paid for multiple maintenance services over the past few years, but when I asked around, no one could recall ever seeing him do any actual work. A quick search revealed that Richard wasn't just a contractor, he was Patricia's brother-in-law. That was enough for me to take action. I brought my findings to the new HOA board and made it clear that this wasn't just about undoing Patricia's damage. If they wanted to prove they were serious about reform, they needed to go after every corrupt deal she had made. The board, already under pressure from the homeowners, had no choice but to act. They immediately froze all outstanding payments to Richard Lanning's company and initiated legal proceedings to recover the funds. But that was only the beginning. The city had already been watching closely after the illegal modifications were exposed, and when they caught wind of the shady contracts, they launched their own investigation. Richard Lanning, thinking he could get away with it, tried to defend himself by claiming the contracts were legitimate. But when the city inspectors demanded proof of work, he had nothing to show. Within weeks, his company was blacklisted from doing business in the area, and he faced serious fines for fraudulent invoicing. Patricia, already drowning in legal trouble, now had another scandal attached to her name. But the real victory came when the HOA successfully sued to recover the misappropriated funds. The money that had been siphoned away under Patricia's leadership was returned to the community, and for the first time in years, homeowners saw their fees reduced. With the financial corruption exposed and Patricia's allies completely discredited, the neighborhood finally had a chance to heal. The new HOA leadership implemented strict transparency policies, requiring all contracts to go through competitive bidding and mandating regular financial reports for homeowners to review. And as for me, I got exactly what I had wanted from the start: a neighborhood that was run fairly, without power-hungry individuals abusing their positions. I could finally enjoy my home in peace, knowing that justice had prevailed. With the HOA stabilized under new leadership and the financial corruption exposed, most of the neighborhood was ready to move on. But I knew better than to assume that everything was completely settled. After everything Patricia had done, there were still loose ends to tie up, and I wasn't about to let anything slip through the cracks. The first sign that there was still trouble came from my next-door neighbor, Kathy. She was one of the few people who had been vocal against Patricia from the start, and now that the dust was settling, she had taken it upon herself to go through every old HOA ruling to see what else had been affected by Patricia's influence. When she knocked on my door one evening, she had a folder in her hands and a look of frustration on her face. She wasted no time before flipping open the folder and showing me a set of documents that had clearly been altered. The dates were inconsistent, and some of the signatures looked like they had been copied and pasted from other documents. What she had found was even worse than I had expected. Patricia hadn't just mismanaged funds, she had been forging approvals for policies that had never actually been voted on. Some of them were minor adjustments to landscaping rules and parking regulations, but others were far more serious. There were policies that allowed her to authorize fines without board approval. There were adjustments to HOA election procedures that had made it nearly impossible for anyone to challenge her leadership. And worst of all, there were penalties that had been enforced on homeowners that had no legal basis whatsoever. Kathy and I spent the next few days digging through everything, cross-referencing documents with older meeting minutes. It became painfully clear that Patricia had been running the HOA like her own personal kingdom, enforcing rules that had never actually been passed while ignoring the ones that were supposed to be in place. We took everything to the new HOA board, expecting them to act quickly, but instead we ran into another problem. The board, while certainly better than Patricia's administration, was hesitant to go back and overturn every questionable ruling she had made. They claimed that reversing too much at once would create chaos and that they needed time to review everything properly. I wasn't buying it. It was clear that some of the new board members still feared rocking the boat too much, worried that if they undid too many of Patricia's decisions, they'd face backlash from the homeowners who had benefited from her favoritism. But I wasn't about to let Patricia's influence linger just because some people were too afraid to clean up the mess properly. So, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of waiting for the board to act, I started bringing the information directly to the homeowners who had been affected. I knocked on doors, explained what we had found, and showed them proof that many of the fines and penalties they had faced over the years were completely illegitimate. Word spread quickly. Homeowners who had been forced to pay outrageous fees for minor infractions were furious. People who had been denied the ability to challenge Patricia's authority realized they had been cheated out of their rights. The pressure on the board mounted fast, and before long, they had no choice but to take action. An emergency town hall was scheduled, and this time, it wasn't just the usual crowd of concerned residents. Nearly the entire neighborhood showed up, demanding answers and accountability. The new president of the HOA, a man named Daniel who had taken over after Patricia's resignation, stood at the front of the meeting room, clearly overwhelmed by the sheer number of people demanding change. He tried to maintain control, but it was obvious that things had reached a breaking point. Kathy and I presented everything we had found, laying out the forged approvals, the illegitimate policies, and the impact they had on homeowners. By the time we finished, the room was practically buzzing with anger. Daniel had no choice but to agree to a full rollback of every policy that had been fraudulently implemented. Every unjust fine that had been issued was to be refunded. Every restrictive rule that had been put in place without proper approval was to be erased. And most importantly, new safeguards were put in place to ensure that no single person could ever manipulate the HOA's authority the way Patricia had. It was a complete overhaul, and for the first time in years, it felt like the HOA was finally working for the homeowners, not against them. But there was still one final piece of justice left to serve. As the investigation into Patricia's misconduct continued, more evidence surfaced that she had personally profited from many of the policies she had put in place. The forged approvals had allowed her to impose fines on homeowners, and a significant portion of those fines had been funneled into accounts linked directly to her. That was enough for the authorities to take action. Patricia was officially charged with fraud and embezzlement, and when the news broke, the entire neighborhood celebrated. It wasn't just about seeing her face consequences, it was about knowing that, finally, her reign of corruption had come to a permanent end. With Patricia gone for good, and the HOA restructured to prevent any future abuse, the neighborhood finally felt like a community again. People who had once been at odds with each other came together, united by the shared experience of taking down a tyrant. And as I stood in my backyard, finally able to enjoy my pool without interference, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was better for it. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. With Patricia gone, the HOA board restructured, and fraudulent fines refunded, the neighborhood had finally started to feel like a community again. People who had once lived in fear of arbitrary citations now stood together, making sure the new leadership remained accountable. But there was still one last battle left to fight. The illegal modifications that Patricia had pushed through had been flagged by the city, and while some had been removed, others were still standing. The board had agreed to either bring them up to code or tear them down, but weeks passed with little progress. Daniel, the new HOA president, insisted that they were working on it, but I had my doubts. The longer they stalled, the more I suspected that something was going on behind the scenes. I started digging again, this time focusing on the contractors that had been hired to do the work. What I found confirmed my suspicions. The same companies that Patricia had been funneling money to were still on the HOA's payroll. Even though she was gone, her influence lingered through the deals she had made. I wasn't going to let that slide. I took a drive around the neighborhood, checking out the structures that were supposed to be either removed or brought up to code. The fencing around the clubhouse still had the same warped sections. The extended walkways remained uneven, and Patricia's old office was suspiciously untouched. Either the contractors hadn't done any work, or they were deliberately dragging their feet to milk more money out of the HOA. I wasn't the only one noticing. Homeowners who had been promised changes were getting frustrated. The board's repeated assurances were wearing thin, and with tensions rising, I decided it was time to force their hand. The next HOA meeting was packed, homeowners eager for answers. Daniel stood at the front, trying to maintain control, but the crowd wasn't in the mood for excuses. I waited until the discussion turned to the pending modifications before making my move. I stepped forward and laid out everything I had found, how the same contractors who had been benefiting under Patricia were still being paid, how no real progress had been made, and how the board was either incompetent or complicit in allowing the delays to continue. I didn't hold back, detailing every instance of negligence, every broken promise, and every attempt to stall. The tension in the room thickened, and Daniel's face turned red as he scrambled for an explanation. But before he could spin any more empty assurances, someone from the back of the room spoke up. It was Greg, one of the more outspoken homeowners. He had been quiet since Patricia's downfall, but now his voice carried through the room. If the board wasn't going to act, then the community would. A vote was called right then and there. Homeowners demanded that all pending projects be reviewed by an independent contractor, one with no ties to Patricia's old regime. The board, caught off guard and outnumbered, had no choice but to agree. Within days, the new contractor arrived, and what they found was worse than expected. Not only were the structures not up to code, but some were outright dangerous. The fencing was poorly installed, the walkways were a tripping hazard, and Patricia's old office. It was built over an old drainage system, meaning it was slowly sinking into the ground. The city was notified immediately. Inspectors arrived, and within a week, they issued a final ruling: everything Patricia had built improperly had to be torn down. The board had no choice but to comply, and just like that, every trace of her influence was erased from the neighborhood. Watching the demolition was satisfying. The fencing came down, the walkways were ripped up, and Patricia's office was reduced to rubble. Homeowners stood by, some cheering, others shaking their heads at how much damage one person's greed had caused. With the last remnants of Patricia's rule gone, the HOA finally had a clean slate. The board, now fully reformed, implemented strict oversight measures, ensuring that no contractor could ever take advantage of the community again. Homeowners were given more say in decisions, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it truly belonged to the people who lived there. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my home without interference. No more arbitrary fines, no more power-hungry HOA dictators, and no more battles just to use my own pool. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally free.